Greetings from Seattle, Washington, and the great Pacific Northwest. I'm Jason Rigdon, and you are listening to the podcast of Mystery, the show that always leaves you with more questions than answers, the podcast where I talk with extraordinary guests about the paranormal, the strange, and the unknown. On this episode, I will be talking with the filmmakers behind the fantastic indie horror movies Corpse and The Hill and the Hole. They are both available on demand with Amazon right now. They are strange, confusing, and beautiful. I highly recommend both films. I think they are works of absolute genius. And talking with these guys was a real privilege. But first, I've got this quick message. Have you seen something weird, something unexplainable? A ghost, a demon, a UFO, or maybe something even stranger? Would you like to share your story? Call the Mystery Hotline at 1-888-726-0055. Leave me a message with your strange story, and I will play it on a future episode of the podcast Mystery. Once again, call the Mystery Hotline at 1-888-726-0055 with your tales of the fantastic, and I will include your voicemail in a future episode of this show. I'm looking for any stories of mysterious experiences, from time slips to alien abductions to Bigfoot sightings. Have you experienced the Mandela effect? Do you have dreams about the future? I want to share your story with my listeners. No story is too strange, weird, or fantastic for the Mystery Hotline. Call my toll-free number right now at 1-888-726-0055 with your story of the strange, the unknown, and the paranormal. I look forward to hearing your voice.
My name is Chris Ernst, and I'm a filmmaker, artist, and musician, and professor. I teach film, and I am part of Bright Rectangle Films, which is just a name for the sort of work that we do together. We have a few different names for different companies, quote unquote, that these gentlemen you will meet in a second. I am part of that collective.
I'm Bill Darmon. I guess filmmaker, screenwriter. I do a lot of other things. We made a few movies, The Hill and the Hole and Corpse.
My name's Drew O'Doherty, and I'm a musician and composer, and I did the music for the films Corpse and The Hill and the Hole that Chris and Bill have made.
Well, thank you all so much for coming on the show today. I've really admired your films, Corpse, and especially the Hill and the Hole. I really loved it. I want to ask you first, on the Bright Rectangle webpage, on the About page, there's a very interesting Venn diagram. I think that's what it's called, a Venn diagram. Do you remember off the top of your head? I think it's a really interesting thing with the experimental film and cult cinema.
Yeah, I think I did that at one point, probably without even checking with Bill, because at one point, we'd been sort of funneling all of our business, both, sort of commercial and otherwise, through Bright Rectangle, probably much to the chagrin of many clients. And so something that I'd set up, I think in trying to, I probably stole it from somebody, honestly. I probably saw somebody doing something with Venn diagrams to sort of, I don't know, put out their brand or something silly along those lines. And I probably cribbed it. And then I just thought about, well, what are the things that, at least, for Bill in my mind, and I don't want to drag Drew into this, but for some of the simpatico stuff that Bill and I share with our creative process, I felt like these sort of were where they met. And some of it includes Drew. I mean, I definitely like the DIY punk rock type thing is Drew and I, not to get too much into our past history and our life stories, because it's not a biography show, but Drew and I've known each other for a really long time, since high school, and we part of where we grew up together, part of the thing we bonded over was music, and part of that music was like the punk rock DIY scene.
And you also include I will mess it up, Fortean stuff and mysticism, which is definitely a theme in your films, it seems.
Yeah, I'd probably say, and I don't know, this is just off the top of my head, Bill, you can correct me if you think that I'm wrong, but I was sort of thinking Bill brings a very, rich Fortean background, and me too, but I feel like, he has sort of a stronger research area there. And I'm come from sort of a little bit more of a weird mystic background. I had a strange upbringing where my parents followed a Indian Sufi guru, and so there's a lot of stuff that I was exposed to in terms of like Eastern mysticism and different types of religions and spiritualities and stuff like that are probably deeply seeped into me. So I'm kind of a head in the clouds mystic in some way.
And how did you all come together to begin collaborating?
I don't know. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking here. Bill, do you want to in terms of the first collaboration, what was that? That was probably, we collaborated on the film that we did right after I finished grad school in Carcosa.
Yeah, that sort of spanned a number of years. I think correct me if I'm wrong. I think you were trying to do a Dagon adaptation at one point.
I probably
or maybe that was just like
the
germ of an idea. Yeah. And it was a great idea. So we, at that point, we weren't doing adaptations. In Carcosa was almost entirely an original thing, right, Chris? I mean, it
was, though, in the crazy script writing process that I subjected you to for that. It was like, I feel like there were some things like I took from maybe either Jules Verne, some quotes or things like that from, I don't want to say like public domain. I mean, it is public domain, but I was thinking of it more as sort of these classic treatises on, exploring new places and new lands. I think it might have been Flatland I quoted in there, something like that. But for the most part, it was, original. And there's a lot of improv involved too. We're working with some improv actors. Yeah, so that was the first project that we worked on together. But, Bill and Drew and I, we all know each other because we all grew up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, or at least we all went to high school there together. And we knew each other, and we were sort of part of the underground teenage high school punk rock scene. And while we didn't start, Drew and I were playing music together at the time. We didn't start making films together until later.
Yeah. Chris and Drew had a really great punk rock band in high school, and so we've known each other. I've known of Chris and Drew since I was like probably 13 or 14. I forget which was the first Picasso show. Somebody handed me their demo. I was in another high school, like an adjacent town, and there was a really rich music scene on Cape Cod in Massachusetts at the time. Who would think? And so I had their demo, so I went to a show. So I knew of they were like local celebrities with this band, and it was great. And friends of mine ended up playing in bands with them. And then over time, I think we all landed on a message board at some point post
I think that you're right. I think that really was. And that was the Vorpal film. It was from your studio at the time. Yeah.
So we've known, at least I've known of them for a long time. They've known each other for a long time, and we've had mutual acquaintances for a very long time. And then we all sort of started working together. I think there was a lot of creative vision that was taking place for a while, where we were sort of like, we'd love to do this, but we can only do this. We all had day jobs and things like that. So it was like this very, very slow, gradual build to doing what we ended up doing over probably the past 5 to 7 years, maybe decade. So, but there's always been an element of geographical horror, definitely in Chris's work, sort of exploring, nightmare toponymy or something existential, the horror of toponymy.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I was probably in grad school couching it as something like hyper-mediated spaces or, some sort of media studies buzzword. But yeah, it's really this idea of the alienation of oneself from their surroundings, or the horror of the horror of indeterminacy and not knowing where you are, or something being unfamiliar, which kind of, if you take that, in an academic sense or in a media study sense, it can pretty easily, transform into making cosmic horror films or Lovecraftian horror films, which deal with pretty much the same thing. But I think one of our touchstones, though, that all of us share, including, this being something that I think was seminal for Drew and I when we were friends and growing up, because we knew each other at the time that it was happening, was David Lynch's Twin Peaks television show, and then sort of the subsequent film Fire Walk with Me that was released. David Lynch has been, a really big influence on all of us in many different ways, I think, since we were very young. And he still is for me. I mean, as we were talking about earlier, it seems like he's a fairly decent person, or it will, in general, as a human being. It sounds like a terrible director to work with, and that he's not nice on set at all. But that happens. But all those other things that we seem to see more and more filmmakers, are responsible for. So far, David Lynch is not. He's just kind of a jerk, which I certainly can be myself.
I think Chris and I met in the beginning of 8th grade. We were both new kids to the same school, but we because we were both new, we didn't have that kind of prejudice against the other one being the new kid, that you sometimes experience as a new kid, or I certainly had previously. But yeah, I think we were the only 13-year-olds we knew who were like, couldn't wait for season 2 of Twin Peaks to start. So that was definitely somewhat foundational. And it was actually funny because I have a cameo in a scene in The Hill and the Hole, and that's filmed in a town called Palmer, Massachusetts. And it was actually the last night of the initial photography. So it somewhat seemed appropriate that ended up being the name.
That's some good synchromysticism. Not only Palmer, but it's a secret society based on sort of Masonic, some sort of warped Masonic symbology.
Bookhouse.
Yeah,
boys.
There you go.
Yeah.
The Bookhouse Boys, right?
Yeah. I also loved David. I would say that Twin Peaks, it was specifically the episode where Lynch, as Gordon Cole is sitting down in the and he can only hear my God, I'm going to embarrass myself as a Twin Peaks fan, the Mad Kinnameek character, Mad Kinnameek, waitress,
Shelley Johnson.
Yeah, and he can only hear Shelley. And I think I was like 15 when I saw that scene. I might be misremembering this. I do this all the time. I have like Mandela effect of the brain, and I might be creating this of whole cloth. But at that moment, I was like, wow, it'd be really great because up to that point, I was just really writing things. It would be really great to like try to make like a short film, in this fashion. And I don't know. Lynch, I hope Lynch survives the purge or whatever's happening right now. So
he's certainly shutting himself up in his studio with his setup. He doesn't call it a studio, his workshop with his setup, and he's doing stuff. So hopefully he's not getting into too much trouble.
You said about being interested in kind of this idea of cosmic horror. Was that something you had been interested in even as like a child? Like a lot of this stuff, this material is quite a bit older than any of us.
I mean, I certainly was. I'll let Bill, and Drew talk about this too in a sec, because they do have different experiences at least. I read a lot of horror literature and cosmic horror when I was a kid, and it probably is something that tapered off right about the time that I met Drew, and I think that sort of coincided with this idea that I wanted to like meet girls and have friends, and in many ways at that time I think being like, when this was, because this was the like late 80s, early 90s, being like, I like Lovecraft and cosmic horror. That was at that time still kind of verboten. And I think I kind of like pressed myself out of that, but it's something that slowly started to come back, like probably after I left high school. Certainly by the time I was like, in graduate school, I was, thoroughly rereading that stuff and reading, new weird things, Jeff Vandermeer and stuff that was coming out and kind of catching up with what was happening. China Miéville, writers like that. But yeah, I used to read a lot of old, like anything from like the kid stuff, like E. Nesbit, if people know, or like Ursula Le Guin, or of course like Lord of the Rings. I also read a lot of Clive Barker. Clive Barker was huge for me. Um, Stephen King, Lovecraft, obviously, but I also really liked a lot of the pulp stuff. So like Robert Bloch and Manly Wade Wellman. A lot of pulp short stories. I was really into that. Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a friend of mine, his mother had the atrocity exhibition in her library, J.G. Ballard's atrocity exhibition.
Oh, right.
I was way too young to be browsing that, and that sort of opened my mind very early on to a lot of material I probably should not have been reading.
That was the research version, right? The like fully illustrated one.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Where like,
oh yeah.
if people aren't familiar, like I think the cover is the medical cross section of the act of fellatio.
Right.
I'm pretty sure.
It gets better from there. Yeah. And it. Yeah, but I mean, similar. I loved also Clive Barker. I was Clive Barker King. Probably a similar trajectory. I mean, it was loads of like fantasy and science fiction when I was really young, and then I avoided Lovecraft for a long time. I had various teachers pushing it on me when I was younger, so I for that reason alone, I think I might have been like freshman in high school or something, and then I just devoured all of that. But I think Jorge Borre was something that really, in a sense, that fiction like that really terrified me more. I loved Lovecraft, style wise, I guess, but there were there's a whole, just various writers. Yeah. Jason, I'm a terrible interview, by the way, so I'll you can lose me. That's Chris can carry my portion for me. So yeah.
I'm laughing because I disagree. He always says this, but it's okay. You're also like a big pulp. I mean, at least now, knowing you now, like you raid the pulp section of any used bookstore that you can get to.
Yeah, I've been really into Oakley Hall lately.
Yeah.
So he writes westerns and mystery novels. I love writers like Joe Lansdale just recently commented on The Hill and the Hole, which was great. I've been
that was like a high point, definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, and Leiber. I love Fritz Leiber. And I don't even really. I do recall. It was The Big Time Change War novel that he wrote. I just picked that up in a used bookstore a long time ago, and I couldn't believe an author like him existed. He was just so prolific, there's still stuff that turns up, stories that just surprise me. Like it's always in his voice, but it's just such a fresh new take on something. So yeah, Leiber quite a bit. And to bring that back around to Cosmic Horror, I also feel Leiber had a more nuanced grasp than Lovecraft on sort of what that was. But, anyhow.
I don't have much to contribute on the subject, except that I can verify that when we were 13-year-olds or whatever, Chris knew the correct pronunciation of Cthulhu because of that the rest of us were stumbling on as Metallica listeners.
I didn't remember that. That's cool. I'm glad I was able to do that. At that point, probably that got me ostracized more than anybody else. Yeah. But I think comic books was it. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jason. I was just going to say another thing that I did want to touch on was comic books too, which I think is something that we did share. I know, Drew, you've said recently when we've all been talking on some of our shared threads about, you're out of the loop on comic books, but I do think that was a big thing like, at least when Drew and I met, that was a huge thing for us, was comic books. And I know that in high school, that was the same for you, Bill. And it is something that, like, we've touched upon again, as an adult. And for me, that's a big influence. I guess if we're talking about influences, which seems to be where I've skewed this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, I forget about it, but at the time that Chris and I met in the 8th grade, we were both kind of, aspiring comic book writers and artists, and had created our own characters and stuff like that. And that we had, at a friend's dad's work, we went and like hit the Xerox machine and made our own comic to sell just at school. And we like sold out of them. Although it was a I think a collab with the other friend who wasn't really an artist or a writer,
Right.
but his dad had
because wasn't there a huge copyright infringement in that? Like, it was one of the original Eastman and Laird ninja, like pre cartooned Ninja Turtles that he wanted to.
I don't remember, but the important thing is his dad has the copy machine, so that's
right. So he could do whatever he wanted. Yeah. Mirage Studios never came after us. So
so far so good.
Exactly. Oh, I just said it, man.
Strike this whole part, Jason. Yeah.
Yeah.
The statute of limitations on.
Well, then what happened with, you're reading all these books, you're even making your own comics and stuff, and you're making music. How did that turn to film to express these kind of ideas, maybe?
I mean, I think it came separately for each of us, though Drew and I at one point, I think before whatever life changes, turned us in whatever the directions we went, we had been talking about going to film school together, like while we were in high school. We ended up instead, moving to Boston and, trying to be in post-punk hardcore bands. I mean, we were in post-punk hardcore bands, but we also realized how difficult it is to, be 18, 19 in a post-punk hardcore band. And from there, like, I went off to school, and Drew moved to New York. And so there's a bunch of other stuff that happened. I think that we were doing music mainly, I think, for the most of that time. But yeah, for me, the film thing, I think it gelled when I went to college, honestly. Though Drew and I were in a, for 3 out of our 4 years of high school, we were in this sort of special AV club class, which I know makes us sound super cool.
And we knew how to say Cthulhu.
And we knew how to say Cthulhu. Exactly.
I'm probably saying wrong now, but.
And we were making films. To some degree, they're probably more like weird, 70s experimental videos, but we certainly were working with the moving image. More, I would say, in like a sketch comedy and strange parody way. But I don't want to, I don't want to set that aside, because I think that could have been more foundational than we think. But I really first started making films proper when I was like in college. And then even then I was making experimental, like structural materialist film, like stuff that was completely within the art sphere. And same even in grad school. It wasn't until after grad school that I started doing, it really was through documentaries. I ended up with some friends of mine that we had like another film collective, and a lot of them were based in the UK. We shot this feature for which I was the cinematographer in Bosnia. It was like this kind of documentary cinema verite film about the Bosnian pyramids. Strangely enough, not coming at it from a Fortean perspective. And I was at that point still sort of on the fence about, Forteana. Or at least Forteana as it applies to my work. But, nonetheless, it was about the Bosnian pyramids, which, if people don't know about them, they are these 3 pyramids. I think he claims there are 3 that were found by this guy Samir Osmanagich, and they were discovered. I'm using air quotes in like 2003, and I mean they're basically have been in the like Ancient Aliens fringe world since then, because this guy Samir Osmanagich is kind of an Ancient Aliens type, I don't want to say huckster, but there is this weird sort of scammy feel to him. And we were there for the first annual pyramid conference where people were, arguing over all this like Graham Hancock, John Anthony West type pyramid stuff. But we were there essentially doing this cinema verite documentary about the town, which is essentially it got pyramid fever, and it renamed everything pyramid, and they were basing their whole future on pyramids, and everybody would talk about the pyramids when they would be discovered, like fully unveiled and unearthed, changing their lives, and they were like digging under and these excavating what they thought were tunnels, and it was crazy. I mean, and I mean that in that it was a really unusual set of events, and I was very surprised by how intensely everybody was into that. So we were basically just using that. We had this actor from Sarajevo who was working with us, and he kind of led us through there in this sort of cinema verite way, pretending that he was like a documentary filmmaker coming back to make a film about this. And from there, I just kind of kept making features of some degree. I was like either shooting them, or then I made my own sort of super no budget one, that was the first one with Bill, and then we sort of built up from there. Bill kind of came at it from a different perspective before we met too, because you can talk about it yourself. I consider him a proper screenwriter and filmmaker, whereas I'm kind of this, weird media artist that stumbled into doing proper films.
Yeah, and I look at it from the opposite side of the sort of the inverse of that. But I starting at high school again. I mean, we mutual friends of ours. Well, I think they were maybe one step removed from you guys. We had a lot of friends making we had a great punk rock scene. We also had a thriving fantasy short film scene on the Cape. It was like, I don't know how to put it. It was sort of like really live action role playing taken to an extent that they sort of gave it their own voice, and I was inspired by these guys. They would just make hundreds of short films. They were a few years older than me. They had beards, and made in T-shirts. And I ended up falling in with them. And we would make these short films on VHS. And we'd wiled away our high school years. Should have been doing much more interesting things than what we were doing, but we were firing bottle rockets at one another in guerrilla costumes in the woods. And that was sort of my start with filmmaking. But I went to Boston University, and they had they had like an American independent cinema program there. So I was I got into school hoping to make like studio movies. Like I wanted to write, big budget studio movies. But I fell in with a professor who was, like an expert on Cassavetes and other independent filmmakers, which I had not been exposed to up to that point. I had, from the perspective that I loved cult cinema, and I'd always be hunting down, obscure movies, usually in like brown paper bags behind, the local mall cinema. But once I got into that program, I was sort of like disillusioned with the studio system completely. I took a few PA jobs, but I was like, this is not for me. I'm more interested in, doing almost everything on your own, which anybody who works for us or assists with us, I'm like, don't do it on your own. Do not follow that path whatsoever. But one thing I did, I was sort of more committed to, screenwriting in a more traditional sense. So I that's probably where Chris and I sort of diverge, because Chris is a lot more experimental with narrative than I am. Because I had some teachers who just they came at things from an experimental filmmaking perspective, but they also they viewed narrative as like this sort of like sacred component, and they really good at sort of instilling that in students. So probably the most valuable thing I got from that program. So after school, I wanted to make the great rock and roll movie, and I spent about 7 or 8 years trying to write the thing instead of other projects that would actually make money. And I was doing, I was working like a desk job, but it taught me a lot. And we were on the side weekends, we were making like really silly short movies for various like festivals and things like that, which were instructive. I mean, but I'd always be, so Chris's output, Chris was going to Hampshire College at the time. Chris's output is like, I wish I was doing what Chris is doing, not firing bottle rockets at one another in our 20s in gorilla costumes, which kept up for at least a decade. But yeah, that's sort of my background. And then it built up to doing the projects that we're doing now, which are really like the only, there was no other objective. It was always, younger, I wanted to potentially be making like, I wanted to be a, Spielbergian filmmaker. But what we're doing now is really all I ever really wanted to do, I realize. I mean, it has a very, very niche audience. And I hope we found one in you, Jason. But we'd also, I think we might count ourselves as members of that audience. So, yeah.
It's a secret society.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if I can follow any way that you get Cassavetes bookended by gorillas and bottle rockets. So I feel like that's pretty succinctly summed up the whole line of work. The one thing, and Chris was saying, the way that our paths diverged when we were younger is although we were both interested in music and film for a long time, he went more straight on into doing film and didn't really work on music for a stretch. And I did the opposite, where I just threw myself into playing in bands and recording and touring and that kind of thing. And occasionally there was opportunities to make some music for other films. And eventually that led us to working together and with Bill.
Because before you ended up did you do Thanksgiving before you ended up scoring my like graduate thesis film?
Yeah, that would have been 2001. Yeah, it's funny I had a few scattered experiences working on doing music for independent films that started when it was like a VHS tape that was mailed to you or FedExed to you, and you would watch it with like a stopwatch and figure out that you need to record 33 seconds of music on tape for this scene and that kind of thing, to jumping forward to doing it all on the computer. And I didn't really have the transition period in between. I just kind of didn't do it for a while. And then when I got back to it, it was all, on my laptop.
So would you call these recent movies, would be calling them adaptations of books be appropriate?
I think so. I mean, they're kind of expansions, at least, I'll talk about Corpse at least. And I think The Hill in the Hole is a little bit different, but The Corpse was like The Corpse. I mean, it literally, from the way I see it, at least, was literally as an experiment. I think Bill described it as being an exegesis of The King in Yellow, which I really liked. And I think that's, is an appropriate way of thinking of it. But I guess I was treating it almost as like a channeled text that we were trying to, quote unquote, reinvoke, and so I had this idea, this concept of The King in Yellow as being kind of this like 0 point for weird fiction, and cosmic horror. And I know that, Arthur Mencken and, a lot of other, argue for the genesis of weird, fiction and cosmic horror being elsewhere. But to me, I kind of wanted to keep it with The King in Yellow, because for something about it seems to me as being like, a pivot point that maybe the other stuff is leading up to it. But anyway, so I imagine it as that. And I sort of was, in a kind of woo mystical way, was thinking that we were trying to reinvoke it. And I wanted to see what could kind of be teased out, because I felt like in some ways it was this, I don't know, like a doorway or a key, or to some kind of Jungian archetype, or it could be used as some sort of archetype or a metonym for some sort of like collective unconscious ideas of cosmic horror. Can get into Jungian ideas of the collective unconscious here, but I probably shouldn't. So, I was thinking that when we were doing it, as Bill is writing it, along side with all these ideas that I have, I wanted to use these sort of like avant-garde techniques and like these sort of techniques of indeterminacy and like surrealist situationist stuff. And, so when we were working with the actors, there was an amount of like, I guess, input that we allowed them to have in terms of what kind of characters they wanted. And from there, I mean, really, like, Bill did this amazing job, I think, of taking The King in Yellow, which is this like this weird book that has like three sort of core stories: the Repairer of Reputations, The Mask, and The Yellow Sign, that are very well connected and have this motif of the King in Yellow and the sort of supernatural, the idea of the Lake of Hali and Hastur and Carcosa, Lost Carcosa. And then there are these other stories in there, and then there's some poems in there, and they're all a little bit connected, but it's really these three shorts that are kind of, I feel like, the linchpin core of it. So Bill was able to kind of intertwine them into something which, resembled this like mumblecore kind of, or at least the way I implemented it was mumblecore kind of, relationships between these different people that were, we replaced late 1800s, New York and Paris bohemians with like millennials in Brooklyn, and we replaced disgraced royalty with like washed up reality TV stars, and so there was this reimagining or reinterpretation of it. And I think that both of them, like, Bill can talk about sort of the short story nature of Liber, but for The King in Yellow, I feel like you're starting off with this really fractured non-narrative piece to begin with. So the best thing to do is to kind of like make something that has the flavor or the mouthfeel of it, if I, dare deign to use those terms. And for my part, at least, and how I was trying to, push the story and the adaptation, as being the co-story writer, I think I was trying to yes, both reinterpret it, but also like reimagine what it is and try to make something which is kind of an interpretation of it, if you will.
Yeah, it almost feels like, in the best possible sense, like a cursed object. The film, it's like it has properties that we screened it at the Anthology Film Archive. Chris screened it there, and when you have it, it sort of definitely in scenes it's sensory overload, and we our lead for The Hill and the Hole, Liam Kelly, was in the audience, and he had a physical reaction to it. And not like a seizure, which some people, I mean, like, that's like the broadest way somebody would approach that. He just had this very emotional physical reaction to what he was seeing, and it's interesting. All I was doing with the script was, what if Robert Chambers produced an episode of The Kardashians or something? That was like my approach. That was my true north. That's all I had. And I love Chambers. I mean, I love the stories, and I was like, how are we going to do this. It was a great idea. And Chris gave me this great treatment, but I was like, this is difficult to tackle. And a lot of this was about, I mean, it was about Chris working with the actors and kind of fleshing out these characters. And so, so the final product is this sort of magical object, I guess. It's charged. So
it is. And I did a lot of I will say I did a lot of chopping of the script too, sort of in the edit, which, at some point karmically I'll have to make up to you. But there was some stuff I think that was a lot there was some really cool stuff that if it had ended up, I think, taking a different direction that was a lot more I don't know, more like John Waters-y. There was these great soliloquies that you had that we still have them on tape, but they don't end up with all this weird other stuff, these crazy sounds I was putting in there. It didn't, for me at least, it didn't as for this one, me having sort of final decision, I was it didn't work. It was, killing your darlings. It makes me smile every time I see that scene, though. I think Britney Spears, there's something about Britney Spears she's talking about in it.
Yeah. I was sad to see that go.
I know.
I'll admit that. But no, I mean, the only, I don't know what your shooting ratio was. It must have been 100-1 or something, because there was a lot.
So much. Yeah. It was those, I made some pretty bad production choice mistakes in that, but we live with it.
I mean, I thought that was, I've seen, there was a 4-hour cut, correct?
At one point, yeah, there was the 4-hour assembly. No one can stomach that. Seeing the negative reviews that I have on some of the aggregators, that would be either that or that would have just blown people's minds.
The normies. Yeah, I mean, I thought the only note I had after seeing something that with those changes was, did you also capture the story beats in the script? And you were like, oh yeah, I got that too. It's not in my 4-hour cut, but I can put those back in there. that was all I had. But it was yeah. I'm always the part of the process that's the most magical for me, including Drew's score, is watching the actors sort of bring the script to life, as mediated through Chris and I, or however that works. And
it is a pretty special thing seeing that. Yeah. But then you're right, Drew's score too. I mean, I definitely think that, at least for Corpse, Drew's score and the sound design done by this guy, Matt Davies, really make it, for me. It wouldn't be the same without those.
Yes, Drew, what are some of the special challenges of making music for these rather strange films?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny. I never got to see the 4-hour cut. And just as a sidebar,
it's not even a cut. It's not I don't know, in the world of Zack Snyder's 4-hour cuts, there was never really a cut. Let's say it was an assembly.
All right. I have not seen more than probably 90 to 100 minutes of footage of this movie at any point in any sequence. Although I've probably seen that 100 minutes or whatever in every possible sequence at some point. Yeah, it was interesting. So on Corpse, I came along much later in the process. They had filmed this a few years earlier, and just the nature of truly independent film that has no one else pushing it forward or funding it or anything like that. It took a while to get to the point where they were going to finish it. So I came aboard for maybe the last 6 or 7 months or so. And, principally, I have been a guitarist in all my life in bands and that sort of thing. And I think the first thing that we had talked about with regard to music was it was going to be no guitars, which was an interesting challenge, just because I, at the time, was, a very poor keyboard player and I'm a little bit better now. But we kind of had fairly open ideas. I had come up with some themes before I think I had seen any of the footage that ultimately ended up sticking around and being in the film. So I hadn't really seen it. It was a different type of scoring experience than certainly than with The Hill and the Hole, where I wasn't really scoring to picture when I got started. I kind of created a couple of these themes that were, keyboard and synth dominated, and a lot of textural material, just kind of reversing and stretching out isolated elements of the themes, and then as it got closer to completion, there would be kind of like a marathon weekend of trying to hit all of the other scenes I hadn't hit yet, or that they hadn't already extracted my existing pieces of music for. I don't know if that sentence made sense, so you can kill it if you want. Earlier, I was watching Corpse for the first time since that anthology Film Archives presentation, and I was texting Bill as I went along, and he was saying that he thinks that he wrote the script on like the 4th of July weekend of 2013, and I was saying that I think that I did the bulk of the writing, recording, and mixing during the Memorial Day weekend of 2017, and essentially that the budget for this film was paid holiday weekends. They're sort of like just chugging all the burnt coffee, and just trying to power through it. But there were moments, once I was more consistently working with, trying to fit the cues in to the specific scenes. Some of them were just kind of serendipitous in terms of, having experimented with trying to warp this piece of music and it turning out to perfectly match the kind of story beat and the length of the scene and that kind of thing. So it was the first feature that I scored, and it was pretty much an experiment every step of the way, but that's pretty consistent with the rest of the film.
I just want to add to Drew's story there. So both The Hill and the Hole, in fact, I think Chris and Drew, every project we've had is sort of like a marathon of like pulling this stuff together. And I don't know why it always seems to happen that way, but I don't know if I should be telling the story, Chris, and you can tell Jason if he should like excise this part, but Chris had this, he was bringing this project together. As far as I understand it, you had a treatment, right? But there was no script. And you had brought the actors together, and they were like, yeah, but what, they were asking you very pointed questions about these characters. And then I got a phone call, and you're like, I need a script that's going to motivate a lot of these crazy things I'm about to do. And I need it like next week. And, yeah, it's something like that.
I probably did. I mean, I'm kind of an asshole like that. So yeah.
No. I mean, it was great. It was it was a great.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize. No, I'm sorry if I said that. If that needs to get bleeped or anything.
Well, I think we all like sort of like do our own thing in our silos, and then we sort of come together in like these, really high octane moments.
I think the problem is that somehow, like, sometimes I think that you guys are with me in my head during the silo time. So when I come out, I forget that we haven't communicated.
Well, and just one other point, well, in other podcasts, we've discussed the budget for The Hill and the Hole. I think Corpse, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. I mean, the only money I saw change hands with that movie was like $100 for pizza the night that you shot the party scene. So a lot of that was begged, borrowed, and stolen. If I'm.
A lot of that was begged, borrowed, and stolen. Yeah, some of it was paid for. I mean, I probably paid for, I mean, just to be quite honest about it, it was less than $10,000 like on my credit card that, and that was because I was in this very particular situation where I had unlimited access because of my job to uh, basically an entire small film studio plus all the gear that all this professional gear. And I lived in New York, and I worked in places that had these really great locations. So, I mean, I'd say there was probably about like, oh God, like $75,000 of in-kind stuff in terms of like location rentals that I didn't have to rent and gear that I didn't have to rent. But yeah, I spent less than 10 grand on it. And then, our company, later on, chipped in some money to help with the sound design, but it was mostly big, borrowed, and steal. You're right. Yep.
We are at just about an hour. Do you folks have time to stick around for a few more questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, sure. If you do. And we're multiplying as being three of us.
Yeah.
There's
even
greater opportunities for
exactly
tangents.
If there's anything pointed you'd like to talk about that's mysterious, we're mysterious guys. We really are.
Yeah. With you're saying about people having kind of a reaction to corpse, I definitely had that after watching it. And, that's not, well, what was unusual about it was, and tell me if I'm wrong, maybe in the 4-hour cut this was different. There's really no violence in that film.
Correct.
Am I wrong?
Correct. There's no violence. It is devoid, besides somebody smashing paper off a table and somebody yelling at somebody else, and then what is implied as someone getting smothered by a pillow, but you really don't see it. There is no overt violence of any kind.
Was that an intentional decision?
Yes, that was. At least in my part, I wanted all of the violence to be in the image itself, if that makes any sense. Like, I wanted the violence to be coming from, or if there is violence, I wanted the uneasiness, what I think violence sometimes produces, at least in a horror film, is that violence is producing a feeling of, depending on the kind of violence it is, unease, or shock, or discomfort, sometimes gross out, depending again on the film. In this case, I was trying to do something which I feel like, again, going back to David Lynch, that David Lynch does really well. Of course, David Lynch has massive amounts of violence in his films, but he also has like a shot of a hallway that makes you sick to your stomach. And that's something that, like, Corpse is probably the last film that me as a filmmaker and cinematographer really was sort of dealing with that idea. Again, Bill, I think, said something about this idea of spatial alienation, being this at the core, or something like that, environments. And, there was still something that I was very consciously trying to do as a, auteur filmmaker, or, guy with his head up his ass who has some weird stuff he wants to do. Basically, I wanted to try to have that sense of unease or disruption not come from physical on-screen violence.
And then when we get to the Hill in the Hole, I really feel like that has, I don't want to say whimsical. I think I described it as, I'm trying to remember what the word I used, but it feels funner a little bit. Was that intentional? Did you want a bit of a change?
I would say that it might be my fault. I don't know if that. I think my resting filmmaker face is mostly like Hal Needham and the Cannonball Run. I've made short films that are, and I think that kind of infected some of it. What ended up happening was we had a project that was initially maybe a bit more grim and tonally straightforward than what we ended up with. and we shot this we shot the Hole in the Hole in 10 days. And or principal photography was 10 days. So we had holes. We didn't have an ending. The ending had to change because we had numerous production issues. We knew that going into it. The crew probably didn't, definitely not the actors, but it was bumpy. But we sort of we had to absorb that, and we had I think one of our most brilliant decisions was bringing Adam Gorightly on board as the villain, and he brought something to the movie that I think, as we went back and we looked at what we had, we're like, this is going in sort of another direction, and the tone became. I don't know. I've heard it described as Pee Wee Herman, and I've heard it described as whimsical by you, Jason. And I prefer whimsical, but it's
somebody recently just described, and this is niche, but as Discordian, it was described as.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think it was always like I guess when I get involved with directing a scene, and Chris and I were co-directing this, and Chris is a master, and I am just sort of bumping along, making horrible suggestions that tend to screw up the tone. It sort of brought something into it that I think, I don't know, it was definitely in the DNA of the original script, but I don't think it was something we were holding back from the actors. I'll put it that way. We didn't want everyone to know that there was this other side to this film, and that, because I think if they had known, it would have affected the tone of the film. And it created definitely created a tension on set, because I think we'd be shooting something and the crew would think we blew it. And we'd be like, that was perfect. And there was no, I don't know if they were looking for us to really communicate what we had in mind, but the idea was to capture something that, was tonally sort of opposed to what was happening in the scene. So I don't know. And Jason, I hate if this is coming out sounding way too pretentious. So if, Chris can fill in. So.
No, the stuff that I'm saying is the stuff that sounds pretentious, probably. Yeah, and I think that's totally right, man. I mean, I think it emerged. I mean, the way I always think about films, and this is probably just me going into my professor spiel, but it's that you kind of make a film, you make a film 3 times. That's the whole Paul Thomas Anderson thing. Not the other Paul, no, was it Paul Thomas PTS Anderson? Is he the guy that does all the films with Mila Jovovich? But no, Paul Thomas Anderson.
Oh yeah, I think he's Mr. Mila Jovovich.
Yeah, he's Mr. Mila Jovovich. All right. But Paul W.S. Anderson, that's the name of the guy. But Paul Thomas Anderson, of Magnolia and the Master fame, he talks about making a film 3 times and how, you make a film once when you make the script, and then you make a film once when you shoot it, and then you make a film once when you edit it. And I really think that, for the biggest thing for me, and this is something that I probably didn't even realize until we've talked about the film, after it's done, is that, really, when Adam came on, he kind of injected it with something. And even when he showed up on set, too, for whatever it was worth, there was something that, for me at least, I kind of got a sense of, or for me, I felt a little bit more like I knew what was happening. Or he added something to it that I think only by the time that we were sort of ending after those 10 days was I finally okay, yeah, we're getting in the groove now. And, if we'd been doing a 30-day shoot, obviously we would have been really in the groove. But it was a learning process, as honestly, all feature films that I've been involved with, it's unfortunate when money is involved, but they are, in many ways a learning process. So I think that, everything that we learned on everything I learned on Corpse, at least, I thought about for better or worse on The Hill in the Hole. And I think definitely the next one that we do will probably have a different flavor, you know? I think some of those different flavors are part of, you know, in the same way that like a band's composition, you know, one song might have a little bit more of, you know, the touch of the guitar player, and one might have a little bit more of the, you know, keyboardist or something like that, but they're all written by the band. You know, I think The Hill in the Hole has like a touch of sort of, you know, where Bill came from. I mean, part of it is me in there too, but it's like, you know, and I think that the next one, who knows, you know, maybe it'll have more of Drew's music will be the thing that's at the forefront. So I could see them changing. I mean, I don't know if we're always going to make sort of Discordian or, you know, really out there Tetsuo Iron Man type, you know, experimental films. We might make more. Some of the stuff that we're kind of talking about now, these things that we have in development, I think are a little bit more, even though they still all engage with Fortean topics or, you know, things that sort of skirt that area of genre filmmaking. I think they all could be slightly different, you know, have different, a different vibe to them, different tone. I like that. I mean, I like, you know, I admire filmmakers that do that don't have one particular style or look or feel.
We had tested the movie quite a bit. I call it a movie because we were really going for something that was a lot more linear than Corpse.
Yeah,
and it's a movie. It feels like a movie. It's something that,
right. It is a movie. Yep.
It's you know, so but so we had tested it, and there were always people in the audience who were like, I loved it up until like the midpoint, and then I don't know what you guys were doing. And then we had the other reaction, which was like, I was left cold until, you know, we got to the Freemason scene and Adam and everything, and then I love the end. I really love the end, and then people were divided over what they call the aliens, which is unfortunate. I don't think we built the world appropriately. A lot of what you're seeing for the for the effects work in the movie is sort of post-viz. It's not finished special effects. It was like, we'd like to take this to somebody who can make this look good. It was, but then it had its own magic. Chris took the designs from the animator who was intending to do some pretty ambitious 3D animations, and Chris, you know, made these models, and the models were perfect. And they were like, you know what, this is it. You know, I mean, this is great. And you know, so it was funny to see how the audience was divided. It was really interesting. And so that was sort of part of the process as well. I mean, we spent a year adjusting things after like a first test screening, you know, and I mean, it's totally bonkers that we were testing this movie. I mean, it's crazy. It's a crazy movie. I don't know what.
I thought it was great. I thought that was a great thing, you know, that happen. I think that actually ended up working really well.
Yeah, and I mean, it was interesting that we got a lot of different perspectives, but then we always found that there was an audience who sort of understood that this was something new. Like there was something else that was coming out of this, and there's sort of you know, alchemy that is occurring because we have non-actors in there that are pitted against some really, really strong actors who are selling this really strange mood, and I don't know, it works for some, and then others, you know. I think I'm hopeful that like in a few years we could like revisit that with some of those folks and see what they think, you know. Anyhow, yeah.
You don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but you may have some ideas here. Do you have any feelings about kind of the current state of mainstream horror movies?
So it's funny because like I can't really answer that one because I don't watch any of those movies. If you make those movies and you would like a dude who can create your music while he's on Zoom meetings, give me a call. Because a lot of that music sounds like it could be made under those circumstances. No, I'm actually, you know, I am in a lot of ways kind of a newcomer to the horror genre, broadly speaking, and I feel, you know, I've seen certain kind of classics here and there, but I've never I've never been deeply into following horror films, and there's a lot of blank spots in my own familiarity when Chris and Bill are referencing other things.
But yet you still were my friend back in the day, even though I think I still had a subscription to Fangoria.
That's true.
At the
Yeah,
time. You were like, you didn't quite give up on me.
I think you had in terms of the sort of like evolution of adolescence, there was definitely like a period where you had like a Rawhead Rex poster in your room. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Wish I still had that.
I wish I still had that. Yep. I think I replaced that with like a Corvette and like a large-breasted woman or something like terrible. Kind of I'm sorry, everybody.
Progression. I'm not super familiar with. It's interesting in that I feel like these two films are horror films in a kind of abstract way. I mean, Corpse being more abstract than The Hill in the Hole, both with regard to your, observations about on-screen violence and that kind of thing. But they're not like, I don't think they're the kinds of films that people would slot into the horror category in the popular film,
like the horror films, the
definition of horror.
The horror films.
So some have correctly compared it to Carpenter. And we were definitely going for a Carpenter vibe. So,
but I remember like the videos that you and I would get in high school, Drew. Like we'd get like, I don't know, Videodrome and Repo Man and Straight to Hell.
True.
And and that I guess is still where I feel like, in my mind, that's where I feel like these films sit, even if they're not, there's something that's, so I agree with you. I mean, I agree that they're not straight horror films. And, Videodrome's a little bit more straight, but I don't know. Did we watch Tetsuo Iron Man in high school? I can't remember.
I remember knowing it existed, but I'm not sure I ever saw it. But yeah, it's funny. I realize I'm getting away from your question, and then I'll let Bill and Chris answer it straight on if they feel up to it. But I feel like the characteristic that is common in both Corpse and The Hill in the Hole is that they have this kind of like otherworldly character to them that feels to me like I'm a teenager and it's like 2 a.m. and I'm watching like a UHF channel and I stumbled onto something in the middle of it and I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to watch it to the end and find out what happens. And I feel like that's definitely probably, that feeling is a shared touchstone among, Chris, Bill, and myself in terms of liking that feeling.
Yeah. And maybe that leads into what at least I am not as much a fan of in terms of horror. I mean, maybe I'm not watching the right stuff. Maybe there's some stuff that I'm completely missing out. I'm sure there is some underground stuff that's being made that's probably more interesting. But like, if you at least talk about, what franchises exist now, well, you kind of have like the Blumhouse side of things, which I've never been a big fan of. And I guess because they seem to me sort of cookie cutter, at least. But, they argue away, that's fine. But at least the ones that I've seen, I appreciate the fact that, Paranormal Activity sort of flipped the production model on its end. That's kind of cool. But at least anything that I've seen, I haven't been a big fan of. The only stuff that I think I've been really jazzed by is like Panos Cosmatos's stuff, so Beyond the Black Rainbow and Mandy. I really like both of those. And then I would actually consider a lot of, Twin Peaks season, the return to be horror to some degree. But for me, that's the best kind. And then, what you've got, the like sort of prestige, art house horror stuff. And I use quotes for that. Again, I'm making some sweeping generalizations and hot takes about this, but, and that's like the Midsummer, that kind of stuff. Hereditary, Ari Aster, which I think those are very well made films in terms of craft. They don't. There's something that I always look for in a horror film, some sort of like, I don't know, some connection to kind of a deeper sense of mythology that I feel is missing. Even from Midsummer, I feel it's kind of like it's going through the motions, but there's not, like, Ari Aster is not really super interested in, sacrifices, in pre-Roman Scandinavia or whatever. So maybe I'm not exposed to enough of what really is, the cool underground horror going on right now. But at least for me, I kind of would like, I kind of would like more stuff that's a bit bonkers, and I think that's what I like about Panos Cosmatos is that, he's doing as he said before, I think, he's trying to make the films that, like, he saw the covers of on the video store when he was a kid, but never saw the films. And, like, he's making the films that he imagined those to be. And I absolutely understand that. Like, I can picture myself in the video store. My parents are picking out whatever, Kramer versus Kramer. And I'm looking at, like, this, whatever it is. I have no idea. The first Nightmare on Elm Street cover or something, and I'm wondering what the hell. I mean, I eventually saw that, obviously, but something about that I think really resonates with me. And maybe more horror fans making horror movies. Maybe that's it.
I'm not really into, like, sort of like I agree with Chris. I think there needs to be more grounding in the actual horror that you see, and I think, like, Eggers does a really good job of that with, like, I mean, The Witch I thought was pretty extraordinary.
Right. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. I completely agree.
Yeah. Eggers is out there shedding a tear right now somewhere. But no, I mean, that, and what did you think of The Lighthouse? Were you...
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. For some reason I didn't talk about this tonight. I should have. Every other time I've talked about it, people ask me what my favorite film of the past, like, couple years is. It's The Lighthouse. Probably because I don't even almost think of it as a horror movie. I don't think of, and that's probably it. Like, I think of it, I mean, it is a horror movie, but I think of it as so much more than that. Yeah, I love it. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, that's what I wish we were seeing in sort of supernatural films. Maybe that's what I thought of. I thought of it as a supernatural film. Maybe I was kind of parsing it in terms of, like, horror. I'm thinking like Freddy and Jason, but that's still supernatural. I don't know. Too many buckets and to put these in, and labels. Yes, that kind of stuff. Eggers, I love that. That's fantastic filmmaking as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of dig the return to, like, sort of the Charles Band movies. It seems like that is he's being sort of reappreciated. I was a huge, Full Moon Entertainment consumer when I was and I think that's interesting. I just recently saw Psycho Gorman. I don't know if this qualifies as horror, but I loved it. I thought it was really good, and but I think Stephen King in Dance Macabre, he summed it up. You need to really be telling stories that connect with our, fears about mortality and things like that if you're making a horror film. And so I guess that is how I sort of, like, look at a lot of stuff. So I would say, like, what would sum up my attitude towards it is I've started digging back and looking at a lot of the classics, like Stuart Gordon. I have a new appreciation for, like, Castle Freak, which I never had before. Maybe that's a controversial opinion, but it's interesting how they were tapping into something that was a bit more primal. And so I don't know, but yeah, I agree. I don't watch enough of new stuff. I don't know, Jason, if you throw out a few films, we can give you, like, the Siskel Ebert, capsule review. So no. So
yeah, I did want to make just the comment that, years and years ago, I worked at a video store and, would pick up all these wonderful VHS tapes of all these horror films. And, I thought I was a horror film fan. And then as time went on, I found less and less stuff that I liked, sadly. And you know what I think really hit me about The Hill and the Hole when I saw it is it was like rediscovering something. Like I took a chance on it, watched it, and it felt like that feeling of taking the VHS home and then being just delighted by something in a way that I hadn't been before. So I really thank you folks for doing that.
Well, thank you for telling us, because
That's great to hear.
yeah, at least for me, that's a success then. One person felt that way. That is exactly how at least I wanted people to feel at the end of the day with that one.
Yeah, no, that's
awesome.
really terrific to hear. Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to joke, and I think I've given Bill a hard time about this before in some other setting, but I've laughed before at Bill saying, "I thought I made a crowd pleaser," with regard to The Hill and the Hole, which, like, grading on the curve, if you'd seen Corpse first, it's definitely got, more elements that you would, find in a movie, to use like that distinction. But it's also, like, without getting into spoilers, it's also like usually, like, crowd pleasers don't end the way that particular film ends in terms of the main character and that kind of thing, or does it? But yeah, it's what I'm saying is I'm glad that you're part of the crowd, Jason. So
Yeah, I'm very happy to have discovered it. And I have kind of a second to last question for you. This is going to be a weird one, but I just really had to ask this. And maybe you can't answer. Are these films, I'm trying to think of now how to say it without sounding like a total dork, are these films intentionally magic? Like, I get that feeling sometimes.
Corpses.
Oh yeah. The Hill and the Hole. We used to do a road series, 40 and road series, and various circumstances. It's dead and buried at this point. But that was sort of in a way like this invocation. It was essentially sort of like a Chapel Perilous sort of experience where we were engaging with the unknown while on the road, and that was sort of what we were doing in a sense with The Hill and the Hole. I mean, we went from a very unusual spot in northwest or maybe central New Mexico to another very unusual, borderline anomalous spot in northeast, and the crew was totally unaware of quite a lot of this, but we were going to these charged places, so there was sort of like voodoo of location involved. Yeah, so there was that element. Chris, your film feels like a hyper sigil. I mean, it feels like, yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's the difference, is that, like, yeah, and that's completely right. Like, Corpse is a hyper sigil. It's, in the way that, if people aren't familiar with that, Grant Morrison's idea of a hyper sigil comes from, the Pete Carroll chaos magic idea of a hyper sigil, or of a sigil, which comes from Austin Osman Spare's idea of a sigil. If people know their magic with a K history and chaos magic, that's what it comes from. And yeah, Corpse is very much a, like, just as you were sort of describing The Hill and the Hole, it made me think that, like, Corpse is, is the equivalent to, you going through and doing, like, all of the Solomonic grimoire rituals in your, in your basement, and trying to, like, do all the spells right and stuff like that. And then The Hill and the Hole is like when you, go down into the Eleusinian mysteries and come out. It was experiential. It was about the place. And I think that it's, like, embedded into the film itself, whereas Corpse was very much, like, artificially kind of put together, or maybe since I used a lot of indeterminacy in the editing and in some other things, maybe it was, sort of channeled or, visionary in that sense. But yeah, The Hill and the Hole was completely this experiential thing that I think just seeped into the performances and into the, the media itself.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for making these films, but also for your time tonight. I've really found this conversation just absolutely fascinating. If people want to learn more about your works and your films, your music, where should they go?
Well, to learn for Bill and I, you can go to brightrectangle.com, immer.com, or the immervideo.com, or thehillinthehole.com. Lots of .coms there. Thehillinthehole.com will be your best portal to get the media. And if people so want physical media, we have that too.
I have some music that's unrelated to these films that's on Bandcamp under my name. So it's just drewodarity.bandcamp.com. But that's like singer-songwriter, guitar player music, and not the kind of music that I've made in these films. I am hoping to someday be able to pull together the sort of motion picture soundtrack album mixes version of The Hill in the Hole. I don't know if I'll ever be able to pull the Corpse soundtrack together off of the old 2008 MacBook that it lives on.
It's okay. You should wrap that in a Shroud of Turin, and
those definitely need to be some sort of like divine intervention involved. I would love to put out the double-sided cassette that has one movie on one side, one on the other. Vinyl's too fancy, but yeah, I have some music there, and I am very behind on trying to get my internet life together in terms of showcasing my work for cinema.
We're way behind the ball, Jason. We got to get our act together. Sorry about that.
We're so behind the ball that when the ball comes around and everybody's heading towards Luddites again, we're going to be ahead of the curve. That's what I'm betting on.
Well, I thank you for joining the technology of podcasting tonight. Like I said, I really love this conversation, and I really look forward to what you will create in the future. That's really exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you. We look forward to it as well.
Thanks for having us on. It's great.
Thank you very much, Jason.
I'm Jason Rigdon, and you have been listening to episode number 17 of the Podcast of Mystery, originally transmitted on
Tuesday, June 15th, 2021.
If you want more information about me, the show, or my guests, please visit podcastofmystery.com. Tune in next Friday when I will be talking to Brian Platt of Seattle's own Mechanical Freak podcast. They will be talking to us about the Giza, Death Star, and the strange world of Joseph P. Farrell. If you have a guest or a topic that you would like to hear on the show, please email podofmystery@gmail.com. You can also send any feedback or comments to that same address. This program is copyrighted by me, Jason Rigdon, in 2021 and is freely available under the Creative Commons Attribution License.